who is running the show.
Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar on SIRS, leaky gut and mold illness. I'm very excited to have Dr. Farshid Rahbar here, who is an integrative gastroenterologist from Los Angeles, joining me on this call. How are you today, Dr. Rahbar?
I am feeling nearly perfect. Thank you very much.
Awesome. I'm actually really excited about talking about this subject with you, and just to really tap into some of the specialized knowledge you have on this subject. And it seems to be such a fascinating field that's evolving all the time, this area of leaky gut and SIBO and inflammatory illnesses. And do you find that this is just such an interesting area overall?
I find it quite fascinating as far as understanding the commonality of the illness, understanding the mechanisms behind it, and the association with a lot of other unexplained inflammatory conditions that we never thought about it this way. I mean, I kind of feel that I've relearned medicine again in the last 10 years, like going back to medical school, trying to pick everything again from the beginning. But
yeah, that's right.
Very exciting.
That's right, and we were never taught any of this at medical school, and it's really all just seems to be coming out in the more recent research. And for someone like myself who's been dealing with hundreds of patients who have got chronic inflammatory response syndrome due to water damaged buildings or due to tick bites or other illnesses, I've often found that gut complaints can be a really big part of their illness, and it can be a very inconvenient part of their illness as well, because the symptoms are very debilitating. It can affect their, every part of their life. So it's really good to know that there are some new solutions and new treatments available that may be able to help these patients. Thanks,
absolutely. And I think it's really a good place to start. Patients are probably more receptive to that concept. And in our practice, at least in gastroenterology, many patients do come with GI problems primarily. The manifestations are primarily GI, and then I had to go back and think about mold and tick-borne illnesses and stealth infections and so forth. So we have to think about it. They don't always come with CRI with that term,
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. And so have you found some patients where, it's almost just gut-related? And a manifestation of exposure to water damaged buildings, for instance?
No, I wouldn't say just gut.
Okay.
When we do a review of system, generally there are other system involvements, and it really points towards which direction we need to go with evaluation.
Okay, great. Well, let's jump into this a bit further, and I really look forward to the different bits of information and new insights that are going to come out. Thank you, Kelvin. Next slide. Okay, so just to get the most out of this webinar, we really recommend giving your full attention if you can. And so if it's possible, please be with us totally here and close any other browser windows. And get, if you would like to, please get some note paper out and make some notes, because there may be some different treatments you may like to explore, or some different avenues of thinking that you may like to explore further in future. Thank you. Okay, so most of you probably know me really well already, but just a very quick introduction. Basically, I'm a physician in Australia who graduated from the University of Queensland, which is in the northeast part of Australia. My initial background was working in intensive care units for around about 5 years. I had a brush with illness myself in around 2005, 2006, and that led me to start exploring the totally new and amazing world of integrative medicine. And that led me to totally switch my career into holistic medicine. And I now have a private holistic practice on the Sunshine Coast in Australia, and I also practice in Sydney. I got interested in mold-related illnesses in around 2012 after my then partner was suffering from, after our house flooded on the Sunshine Coast. And I could not understand what the reason was that she was suffering from this multi-system illness when she had only been exposed to seemingly innocuous mold. However, I was able to seek out Dr. Richie Shoemaker and his colleagues and do the physician training, and then came to understand that there is actually a well-documented, scientifically documented physiology whereby water damaged buildings can really affect a person and turn them from someone who is relatively well to someone who is very unwell. And I was lucky enough to be part of the physician's consensus statement with Drs. Ackerley, Bernstein, Rappaport, McMahon, and Dr. Shoemaker himself. And there's my website there on the bottom of this slide if you'd like to check me out and sign up to the newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Rahbar, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit and your background and how you got into this integrative view of gastroenterology?
Right, I'll be quick about that. I practiced since 1986 more traditional model of gastroenterology. And again, like many other functional practitioners, there was some sort of prompt or incident that caused one to think about, why do we need to go into integrative or functional model? And, I had my beloved suffering from orthostatic hypotension and some other nutritional deficiencies that they were unexplained. And I could not find a simple answer in traditional model. And we started to explore. And after that, I kind of felt I was becoming a conference junkie, going from one place to another. And felt that it's probably best to see if we can integrate the models from the East and the West, because I can't give up what I learned for many years. And that has turned out to bring more levels of armamentarium and tools in our hands when dealing with different levels of illness with the patients.
Great, and it's interesting to see that you're actually a board member, an educational committee member for ILADS. And for those who don't know, ILADS is the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society, and they have a real interest in Lyme-like illnesses and co-infections and so on. And has that been quite a big part of your practice as well, Dr. Rahbar, for the last few years?
Yes, I just want to make one correction. I was on the board until November of 2017, so my period finished. I have other roles now. I just wanted to make that clear. But we kind of fortuitously got into understanding tick-borne illness or vector-borne illness. I don't want to use the word just tick because it's not just one infection. Many patients with susceptible HLA backgrounds, they can harbor multiple infections. And that opened up a completely new era of understanding for us. Again, another level of chronic inflammatory response syndrome, if you will, that it may be mitigated by infections than just the biological toxin that one may encounter from the mold. We also realized that the two actually quite commonly coexist, and one may trigger another one. And we can talk about that more as we go through it.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Carl. Okay, great. So I'm just going to spend a moment revising chronic inflammatory response syndrome, if that's okay with you, Dr. Rahbar, just to get straight in people's head, what is CIRS or SIRS, and how does it actually lead to this multi-system condition, which we call SIRS? And really, as per Dr. Shoemaker's research and understanding, really what he described is that certain genetically susceptible individuals, who may be around about 25% of the population, when exposed to biotoxins and inflammagens from water damaged buildings or tick bites or other sources of stealth infections, or even infected bodies of water or infected reef fish, which is fairly rare. What happens is, instead of creating a proper immune response or a proper antibody response, they develop a chronic and inefficient inflammatory response. And that leads to gene dysregulation and brain changes. So Dr. Ackerley likes to call it the brain on fire, which I think is an excellent term. And really, actually, the body is on fire. the whole body is on fire, not just the brain. And so what that means is that there's a silent fire going on in the body of inflammation. And inflammation means that there are certain compounds that are elevated that are causing damage to different tissues of the body. And therefore one feels unwell. And when one has SIRS, you generally don't just feel unwell in one department. So for instance, as you said, Dr. Rahbar, you don't just get abdominal pains or bloating, even though the patient may come in just saying my problem is abdominal pains and bloating. But if you go deeper, you probably find that they've actually got anxiety, they've got headaches, they've got fatigue, they've got insomnia, they've got muscle pains. So it's actually not a localized syndrome, it's the whole body. And sometimes this syndrome can even continue when the exposure to the original trigger, such as a water damage building, has been removed. So sometimes that inflammatory response can still be there, and it needs specific treatments to bring that inflammatory response back to normal. Would you like to add to that at all, Dr. Rahbar, or anything else you'd like to say?
No, actually, I believe you said it quite perfectly. I think we can move on from the basic, but I'm sure that this subject will come up again in different ways as we talk about it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so now jumping more into your area. So it seems that just over the last maybe 10 years, the interest in SIBO, which stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and leaky gut, which is this concept of an inflamed gut, which is letting in foreign proteins into the bloodstream, has become more and more studied, and there's been a lot more interest in it. Could you talk a little bit about those conditions and also small intestinal fungal overgrowth and what you understand them to mean and why you think they are a big problem?
Well, let's just start with a very basic concept that the small intestine, it's really a sterile. The load of bacteria in the proximal small bowel is very low, perhaps 1 to the power of 3, and that's basically 1,000. However, the studies now show that if that number goes higher, the excess number of bacteria in the proximal small bowel, it will interfere with the proper gut function, and it will add to symptoms that may sound like malabsorption and micronutrient deficiencies and so forth. Now, as we learned that this alterations of the small bowel microbiome, in simple words, you can call it dysbiosis. It may be bacterial, it may be fungal, it may be both. There's no limit that would. There's no reason to just believe that only one may exist, and physicians should be on the lookout to watch for other manifestations as well. So traditionally, the SIBO is attributed to a post-infectious type of phenomenon where after a component of food poisoning, a person may develop the antibodies to vinculin and to CDTB, which is cytotoxin descending antibody B, and this was well described by Mark Pimentel research and published in POLS not too long ago. And there's commercially available tests now to check for vinculin antibody and the CDTB antibody. However, some number of patients do not necessarily have these antibodies. They still have SIBO, and they may or may not have a fungal element into that. And I like to, talk a little bit about that because it's not so easy to make an assessment of fungal overgrowth in the small bowel. One may be able to look at organic acids in the urine, look for fungal growth in the stool, but eventually it comes to understanding the clinical picture and the response to the therapeutic trials that take place. And I think the mindset should be that these things could coexist with or without presence of parasites if there was exposure to a contaminated food or water source. And there are so many factors that they modify this cleanliness, basically, or sterility of this small bowel. And we can go over some potential risk factors on that one as well.
Right. So in other words, sometimes it's more of a classic presentation of SIBO, and sometimes it's not so classic. And the classic ones would generally have the antivinculin antibodies. Is that correct?
That is right.
Okay. Thanks for that. Would you like to talk a little bit about the leaky gut side now, Dr. Rahbar?
Just to elaborate a little bit more on the SIBO, I mean,
Yeah, sure.
I'm not sure the familiarity of the physicians or patients who are listening to this, but obviously we have hydrogen predominant and methane predominant, and then the combination of both of these things. The leaky gut term, which was something that was not previously readily used by physicians, I'm seeing it more and more even in the classical journals, and I don't think one should look at that as a taboo or something bad. It really is a simple way of saying increased intestinal permeability. And permeability measurement at the level of the science and physiologic testing is done by highly sophisticated instrument on the tissue level, where they measure the TEER, which stands for transepithelial electrical stimulation test that they do to be able to see the levels at the research studies. However, that test is not commercially available, so we use a variety of indirect ways or crude ways to measure, quote, leaky gut. Okay? And it's not something that we can easily see at microscopic level, so we need to look at the functionality. Okay? Traditionally, the lactulose mannitol test has been used, and if it's abnormal, it generally suggests that there's a major leak going on. But you can have a normal lactulose mannitol test and still have the general concept of the leaky gut going on for the person. Many of these patients present with food sensitivities and a variety of those symptoms that are described in the CIRS, classical presentations. Many patients, they may come with the skin sensitivities or rashes that are unexplained. And part of our practice has now become even sometimes seeing patients with chronic uninflamed skin problems that they don't really have a name and it's not clear what to do with them. In these type of patients, the gut dysbiosis is very common, and it contributes to the damage to the surface lining of the gut and to what we call the leaky gut. But to be able to understand the leaky gut a little bit better and the mechanisms behind it, we need to know what happens. It generally has been described as a problem with transport through the cells, enterocytes, the cells that they cover the intestines. And as you know, the intestines are just covered by one layer cell. It's not like the skin, which has hundreds of layers to protect it. So the gut inside is extremely vulnerable because there's only one layer protecting us from the outside world. Another possibility would be that the junction between the cells could be affected, and those proteins that they hold it tight, they may be affected by the infection next to it or some other mechanisms, heavy metal or toxicity of other types. And another one, which actually was presented just a few years ago in GI literature, and I found it to be very fascinating by the group from Canada. They did the microscopic studies using endoscope, and they counted the number of holes in the gut. And this is what they call extrusion or dropout of the cells. The reality is that the intestinal cells, they're in constant stage of turnover. And every probably 15 to 20 minutes, they get replaced in the animal models. So human surface of the gut may be replaced maybe every 5 to 7 days. And one needs extreme number of stem cells to be able to constantly be able to create these cells, bring it to the surface, and repair the surface. So if that repair process is slowed down for any reason, inflammation, malnutrition, then we will have more holes in the gut, not just issues with the tight junction, but we'll have more holes. And those substances are detected by the immune system, and you're going to have a variety of inflammatory conditions detected. And I think the TGF-beta, which in the picture, one of the slides I saw, they very nicely demonstrated as how this basically modulates the inflammation behind the surface of the gut.
Okay, great. So to summarize, would you say a simple way of understanding leaky gut for just a layperson might be just to really the concept that the gut's not keeping away the foreign invaders that it should, or not keeping out the foreign proteins that it should? Is that a simple?
Yeah, that's a simple way, or we can say that it has lost its ability to pick and choose.
Oh,
Because
that's good. I
obviously,
like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
if I want to bring this one in, but you got to stay outside. That
Yeah.
selection process has been affected, if you will.
Yeah.
And from what we understand, either dropout, tight junction, or damage to the enterocyte itself may be causing that.
Great. And with this, and just to reiterate on SIBO, you could really simply understand that as being too many bacteria where they shouldn't be.
That's right.
And so, in a sense, most bacteria in the should be in the large bowel. It's not normal to have a lot of bacteria at the end of the small bowel, and therefore part of the problem, if I understand correctly, is that the motility of the intestines, meaning the contraction of the intestines, may be part of the problem. Is that correct?
Right, and I think that may be one of the mechanisms, just for the audience to know that in the upper intestines, the number of bacteria is 10 to the power of 3, but as you get to the colon, is 10 to the power of 13. So there is an exponential increase, but this is a stepwise. So as we go further down into the gut, the number goes up. And obviously, if there's a backup of that system, one will have SIBO by definition. Okay, please go to the next question. I hope I answered that.
Okay, so talking a little bit more now about the risk factors and some of the symptoms that go along with these conditions. Would you like to talk about those areas a little bit, Dr. Rahbar?
Well, what we see commonly, in the practice, and I think your slides demonstrate the common symptoms and how they may be related to the SIBO. Without trying to go to that extent, generally patients come with abdominal pain, cramping, altered bowel habits, and particularly bloating and flatulence. It's very interesting that these two simple symptoms, which I would say that when I started my practice, when there was a lot of bloating, there was a backdoor we would run out, so we don't have to deal with that. But generally speaking, it's a sign of fermentation. And it's very, very important to be able to recognize that the excess flatulence and bloating, rumbling, noise in the abdomen is not normal. And it suggests there's either excess amount of bacteria or fungi present, dealing or interacting with food substrates and producing this phenomenon. And I think the take-home message should be that that particular symptom should not be taken lightly.
Okay, great. So in a sense, these gases are being produced by the bacteria or the fungus fermenting mainly carbohydrates. Is that correct?
Carbohydrates would be the prime target, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And that causes gas, and a lot of the symptoms seem to be caused by the fact that the gas then distends the intestines. Is that right?
The symptoms may be because of distension or by the immune provocation as a consequence of the leaky gut and so forth that we just talked about. Okay. And you asked about motility. Just to make a quick comment, one of the causes of the SIBO is basically loss of what they call ICC cells or interstitial cells of Cajal. And Cajal, a pathologist who described this from Spain over 100 years ago, I mean, these cells are part of the physiological and anatomical presence, if you will, and during this autoimmune response, they get damaged and we lose these ICC cells. And it's not completely clear if they would actually come back. But the more of those loss we have, the more issues we have with intestinal motility and keeping the gut clean, if you will.
Great, thanks. Okay, great. We go to the next slide, thanks. Okay, and so you've talked a little bit already about some of the testing modalities for SIBO and leaky gut. Would you mind just elaborating a little bit about the breath testing in particular and how that can be beneficial in diagnosing SIBO?
Well, breath testing for SIBO, it uses basically the concept of the fermentation using a substrate, in this case sugar. The majority of the time physicians use lactulose because it has the ability to reach lower down into the small intestine and colon and be able to pick up the fermentation process further down. If the test is negative, and generally I would say if there's SIBO, the test has a sensitivity of about 80 to 90%, if you will. Sometimes physicians may use glucose as a substrate. Glucose, on the other hand, because it gets absorbed, it is mainly good for looking at SIBO in the upper part of the intestine. So if I suspect, the SIBO may be more proximal and I might have missed it by doing a lactulose test, the glucose could be an alternative. We have tried that for some patients. I have not found it to be very helpful as an extra measure, but again, the tool is available, and some people even go further to do a fructose test because some bacteria may be more prone to using the fructose as fermentation substrate. Okay.
So in the majority of people, you just recommend doing the lactulose breath test then?
Yeah, lactulose should be really the first step to do it. It's not absorbable and would have less chance of challenging the patient as well. Glucose, if the patient has a fungal element, I would be concerned that it's going to set off fungus-related symptoms by just doing the test. So, if we highly suspect that, I definitely would not use a glucose test.
Okay.
I may just do it clinically.
Great, thank you for that tip. Okay, and so in general, so you're saying it has a sensitivity around 80%. So if someone still feels that they may have SIBO, like for instance, they're getting a lot of gas and bloating and so on, but their lactulose test is not clearly positive, what would you suggest they do in those cases if further investigation seems warranted?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say 80 to 90%, although the literature may vary on that. But, when you look at the breath test results, either the test is clearly normal or is clearly abnormal. And then you have these, patients who fall in between. And in our previous presentation, one of the conferences, we put guidelines at how one may be able to still do interpretation when it is slightly deviates from when it doesn't meet classical criteria. And when I say classical criteria, I'm referring to the criteria that was established by the consensus conference back in 2016. Again, this was the experience of people from all over the world giving their opinion. And I can assure you in the background, I know that there's some differences in opinion when you talk to each physician separately. So one has to use some clinical judgment in this scenario. If I highly suspect it, I may want to treat it.
Okay.
If I see growth of yeast in the stool, then I would speculate maybe the yeast is the player. If the organic acid shows some yeast products in the urine, again, I may speculate that the yeast may be the player. So I may change my treatment protocol.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks a lot. And so moving on to the testing for leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability, I think you mentioned that the lactulose mannitol test is still considered to be the gold standard. Would you like to just maybe take us through how that test works?
I think you have a slide there, and maybe you can bring it up. Yeah.
Different slide. Can you see? Have you got the one up that's got the lactulose and mannitol on the right side of the screen there?
The mannitol would be. Is it up? Because I'm not sure if I can see it. I think
you can't see it. So can you see down in the bottom right? If you double click on the slides, they should become full screen, and then you can see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, lactulose is felt to go mainly in between the cells, and the mannitol goes more through the cells. So if you find an imbalance there, then you can make an interpretation. For example, if mannitol is not going through the cells, then there may be a problem with enterocyte. If the lactulose goes heavily through the in between the cells, and you find a high collection in the urine, then you have a ratio that would be consistent with the leaky gut. Again, each of these scenarios for interpretation can be done after the test results are ready. In the example that you have here, you can see the lactulose recovery is high and the mannitol recovery is low. So the ratio looks terribly abnormal. Okay. And then apparently after the treatment, you can see that the lactulose is reduced and the mannitol is improved. So the ratio is corrected into the normal range.
Okay, great. So would you say it's not normal for lactulose to appear in the urine? Is that correct? Because it shouldn't really be absorbed at all, while it is normal to have a lot of mannitol in the urine. So what's happened in this case is the person has absorbed a lot of lactulose where they shouldn't, and they haven't absorbed a lot of mannitol when they should. And so it's showing the fact that the gut is not doing the right thing.
Exactly. So that simply means there's a problem with the cells and the junctions, both of them.
Great, thank you for explaining that. And do you find that testing such as antibody panels and zonulin or occludin are helpful in these conditions in general?
I do. Again, when we talked about indirect way of measuring it, as opposed to doing the TERs, we use the CIRS Array2, which is antibody to occludin, zonulin, and the LPS, the lipopolysaccharide. And I use that as an indirect way to say that the pores are open, if you will. And I think it may be reasonable to do it because it's much easier than trying to do a lactulose mannitol urine test.
Okay, great. So that's CIRS, which array, sorry?
Array2.
Array2, great. And I think that may not be available to overseas patients at this point. It may just be available to United States, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, okay. I do apologize. Maybe making a mistake on the array number, either 2 or 3. But CIRS lab does have this test.
Okay, great. So, but in other countries, for instance, there could be tests such as secretory IgA and food intolerance panel, IgG panels, and so on. Do you find that they can be of some benefit in some cases?
100%, absolutely.
Okay,
we use this cell-mediated reactions, which is the ALCAT test. We use IgG model, which is generally not covered in US, by many of the carriers, but I still find it very valuable to give us an overall idea if we're dealing with increased intestinal permeability.
Okay, great. So there is a range of indirect tests then that can indicate leaky gut rather than just using the intestinal permeability test, it sounds like. So that's really important. That's really important information for our viewers. Okay, great. Thanks very much. Next slide. Okay, so just changing gears a little bit here now. Just thinking about, you and I have both seen patients who have mold or Lyme-related SIRS who have a lot of gut problems. And it's interesting to reflect on why is this, why is SIBO and leaky gut and related conditions so common in SIRS? Would you mind talking a little bit about that and sharing your thoughts, Dr. Rahbar?
Absolutely. I will share our observation and then we can relate to these slides as well so we can correlate them. Because this type of discussion obviously is in none of the classical textbooks, so I would not expect this to be presented in a ground round or something of that nature. Okay. First of all, we have seen high level of association with abnormal nasal microbiome. Even as a GI physician, we have started to culture the nose, and we have seen a variety of bacteria and sometimes fungi that I don't believe it should be in the nose microbiome. For example, why would Enterococcus or E. coli be seen in the nasal cultures if those belong to the gut environment? And that generally suggests exposure to an environment that these type of bacteria may be pulverized in the air, or the nasal cavity might have lost some of its ability to keep the environment clean, and perhaps there's abnormal mucus that may be promoting this type of phenomenon. Among those patients, we saw a good number of patients having the MARCoNS. And I'm sure that the audience is familiar with this term, the multiple antibiotic resistant coagulase negative staph. And from the little knowledge that I have and I've learned through our colleagues, the MARCoNS are commonly associated with reduced MSH, MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone.
Yes. Yeah.
And somehow the bugs communicate with the brain, and the MSH drops. But this particular hormone has significant effect in immune system balancing of the gut. So hypothetically, that may be a mechanism by which the gut doesn't have the integrity that it should have to keep itself clean, or to reduce the inflammatory response to the antigens that they permeate through the gut. And I think beyond that, then, if you have a leaky gut, then you have the TGF-beta there that it may be dysregulated, and now you have created a cascade of an inflammatory process. So in our practice, to be able to help patients, we feel that the nose microbiome has to be checked. I mean, is there anatomical abnormality, sinus deviation? And that generally requires a formal ENT consultation, particularly for symptomatic patients. Even though the symptoms could be subtle, I wouldn't, ignore some postnasal discharge. My nose runs a little bit. I'm generally congested. Patients with that type of symptom generally have abnormal cultures that it needs to be addressed by itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you've zoned in on the nasal microbiome. And I know Dale Bredesen on one of our previous webinars was also talking about that, that he feels that the nasal microbiome is probably a really important area of future research. And it sounds like there is a correlation from what you're saying between abnormalities of the nasal microbiome and then the GI microbiome.
100%. And again, we kind of learned this fortuitously by remaining quite humble, noticing that some patients with SIBO that they were not adequately responding to the treatment, or they get better and then they get recurrent SIBO. And some of these patients had negative vinculin and CDT-B antibodies, so I couldn't explain that they were getting the recurrent infection based on a motility issue. And then when we cultured the nose, we realized that they had definitely some stuff going on in that area.
Okay, great. And you mentioned that some of the inflammatory markers, which are often abnormal in SIRS, such as MSH or melanocyte stimulating hormone, and also TGF-beta 1, may also be part of the picture here. And it really seems that MSH perhaps has an effect on the tight junctions itself, and may actually, physically contribute to the gut becoming more leaky. And is that a simple way for people to maybe understand how this inflammatory response of SIRS then results in this leaky gut condition?
I mean, to put it in simple terms, I think conceivably that association is something at least that I keep in mind. If you ask me to present a lot of literature behind it, I probably need to do a lot of digging. But that's the concept that we currently operate from. Okay, and hopefully we will evolve and learn more about that as we go along.
Okay, great. And it also seems that there is a two-way correlation between the gut and TGF-beta levels. And so one thing is that it appears that when one starts to get abnormal gut flora, that can also increase TGF-beta. And if one already has elevated TGF-beta levels, that could also have an inflaming effect on the gut. So that's interesting how it almost seems to be a two-way, there's a two-way communication, if you like, between inflammation and the gut. Is that a reasonable way of putting it?
100%. Indeed. I always say, is there a point of no return? that
Yeah.
we have entered into a vicious cycle
Yeah.
in a phenomenon that is quite, my lights went off. uh, um,
Yeah, and so a lot
yeah,
of things in health a lot of chronic health problems seem to involve vicious cycles where the body seems to just be going round and round, and one thing is perpetuating another, and another thing is perpetuating another. And sometimes for people who are suffering with these syndromes, they can start feeling like it's impossible to break out of that vicious cycle. Do you have anything that you could say to that kind of conundrum?
well, I definitely would like to go forward with an attitude that we can break the cycle, so that is not completely out of control. But
Hmm.
one has to decide about what I call a starting point. You got to start from somewhere. And in the case of the mycotoxins, for example, and SIRS, do we start with the binders? Do we start to reduce the load, or shall we start with the gut microbiome or correction of the micronutrients, or maybe some basic hormonal balancing? Maybe I got to take care of the nose. In my
Hmm.
practice, as I've kind of evolved into this, if I feel the person has an abnormal nasal microbiome, I almost go after that first, or I do it concurrently with the gut itself. Again, in instances where we were somewhat involved with dealing with a mold-related illness, um, taking the patient out of the environment or correcting the environment is crucial.
Yeah.
But I personally probably would not initiate a binder immediately unless I feel that the absorption issues and detox pathways are somewhat supported to
Uh-huh.
reduce the chances of die off or some other burden, if you
Okay.
wish to call it.
And that's a really interesting point. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and how you might support someone to detoxify better as part of this process of eliminating mold toxins or which other biotoxins they may have been exposed to?
Well, uh, assuming that the burden has been reduced, that we're not constantly exposed to it. For example, in reviewing the materials that you had provided, you said, look, everywhere you go and live, is a target or suspect. And I even tell the patients sometimes you need to think about your automobile. Some of the
Yeah,
automobiles,
absolutely.
may have air conditioner at home. The newer conditioner systems, when you turn it off, it goes for another 5 minutes to dry up the duct. The car, when you turn it off, and if the air conditioner was on, the moisture remains in the channels. And in one instance, a few years ago, I had to take my own car, very nice brand, but when I went back to the shop, they took the ducts out. It was full of mildew. So it's
Yeah.
very, very easy to do this. So assuming that the burden is reduced, the next step, if there's evidence of malabsorption, we usually do comprehensive nutrition analysis
Hmm.
to see how we can target the nutrient replacement, maybe putting some stomach acid, some enzymes, correcting the infections. And then occasionally we use additional herbs to stimulate the NRF2, NRF2 in the liver, and see if we can actually support the liver's natural detox pathways. Some patients may require oral glutathione or lipoic acid or NAC or by injection. So a variety of these things we use to support the detox first.
Great. Thank you so much. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about MARCoNS particularly, but also maybe nasal fungus and other abnormal species in the nasal microbiome. Would you like to talk a little bit about some of the treatments that you might use when people have an altered nasal microbiome?
Um, First, let me make an announcement. I'm not really the ENT specialist. Okay. So I do it to the capacity that I find it straightforward and easy and is not so complicated. In cases that are I feel there's anatomical problem or the patient has a lot of symptoms, I do refer. And in those cases that we refer to a specialized ENT who understand this concept, we found significant amount of pathology that needed to be concurrently addressed. But let's say somebody has very little symptoms, okay? In those cases, I don't necessarily jump into giving nasal antibiotics or antifungals. We found out that proper irrigation is very helpful. And if you do a good irrigation once or twice a day, and also use a biofilm buster for the nose, that may do the job. If we just remove the heavy mucus, the body may get a chance to do its own repair process. So for some of our patients, we have used mucus breakers, and I looked at the stuff that was used by different physicians, EDTA, NAC, and these are easy and safe to use. And even xylofos, which is made from xylitol, was recommended by some of the pharmacists that they were using it as excipient. So I asked them not to put any drug as an ingredient and just to use the fillers as a biofilm buster. So the patient opens this, mix it with saline, and they use nasal irrigation only with the biofilm breakers. To go one step higher, we sometimes add silver wash to this, okay? And again, that may suffice in some of the simpler cases, if you will. If the patient obviously does not get better, it would require a formal ENT evaluation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And it's worth also noting that as part of the Shoemaker protocol now, the BEG nasal spray has been replaced with the colloidal silver and EDTA nasal spray for treatment of the nasal MARCoNS. And xylitol is certainly something that seems to also be helpful. So thank you for that, Dr. Rahbar. Next slide, thanks. So jumping ahead now onto SIBO. So let's say someone has got those symptoms that you described, such as abdominal pain and bloating and flatulence, and they have come up positive on a breath test. Could you talk about a little bit about the treatment that you may want to give to these patients and what might help them to recover their small intestinal biome?
Absolutely. So the first thing is after we have a breath test available, results available, we're going to ask, is this a hydrogen producer? Is it methane producer? Is it both? And are we dealing with a possible background of fungus as well? Many of patients do not have a fungal issue. So I don't want to make that a big deal, but at times it's something we do need to entertain concurrently. If the patient is a hydrogen producer, I generally give them the classical treatment, and it's my role to inform the patient. Rifaximin, for example, has been tried, and it has about 80% success rate if you treat a SIBO with primarily hydrogen. If there's methane, one may consider adding neomycin or metronidazole or tinidazole. Tinidazole in US would be expensive, so sometimes we have used metronidazole as another one. Classically, neomycin is the one which has been used and is the one with the most research to the data that Dr. Pimentel had presented. The interesting part is that the rifaximin, it actually protects the other antibiotic from becoming resistant, because the bugs are smart and they pass their genetic code through plasmids. And apparently rifaximin basically blocks this plasmid transmission of antibiotic resistance genes. So if you use rifaximin with neomycin, neomycin will continue to be a good antibiotic if you have to retreat. If you use neomycin by itself, the chance of resistance for the next round of treatment would be high. Neomycin alone may have about 30% chance of eradicating the SIBO, and if it's rifaximin alone and is methane, would have about 20% chance. You do both of them together, the response rate may go up to about 80%, if you will. In those patients who are recurrent, I would think about a motility issue, a lifestyle problem, a stress, alcohol, or a bad nasal microbiome. Now, if I highly suspect the fungus is a player, again, this is not based on textbooks, but what I usually do, I take an herbal approach. the herbs don't seem to be so specific about which bugs they go after. Maybe that's a safer way of dealing with it. So I use a combination of herbs. Some of these have been published by Dr. Mullins, but we kind of add to that, and I like to use maybe 4 herbs to be able to capture both the fungi and the bacteria and reduce the load of the excess bacteria in the small bowel.
Right. And so for some people, it can be a little bit confusing just to think about the idea of treating the gut with antibiotics, because in many people's mind, it's like, well, antibiotics are bad for the gut. Could you just speak to that idea and why this is a little different in this case?
Well, there is always concern, okay, but there are a few things to consider. It is very rare that, at least in our practice, and I think a lot of other GI physicians, that they use traditional antibiotics for treatment of SIBO. I don't remember having used ciprofloxacin or levofloxacin for SIBO alone, although we used to do it over 10 years ago. So rifaximin is different. Rifaximin seems to target the small bowel, but it does not seem to change the microbiome in the colon. Apparently, it crystallizes or changes composition by the time it gets to the colon. So there's much less concern about changes of the microbiome when you're using rifaximin alone. If you add neomycin or metronidazole, then of course there's more concern. But it's like anything else in medicine, is balancing the benefits with the risks, and then looking at the patient's symptoms, and then making a mutual or informed decision after the discussion with the patient.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, that's good. That's a very good answer. Thank you. And would you like to talk a little bit about natural treatments as well, and what place you think they may have in treatment of SIBO?
Originally, we used herbal products as a rescue measure. You know, like if my rifaximin and neomycin failed, then I said, okay, let me give a trial of the herbs. I don't use single herbs. Okay, so most of the stuff that we use are proprietary blends, and the products, they have multiple, components into them, and it would be beyond the discussion of this presentation. I mean, if somebody wanted, I can use name the products that we use, but berberine could be in one of them. Okay, but I don't use berberine alone unless I'm using it as a maintenance, just to kind of keep things under control. Or if I feel there's an issue with insulin sensitivity, obesity, of something of that nature, that I want to get some cardiovascular benefits from that. Okay. But the combination of 4 herbs, which one of them is allicin, the other one is ADP, which is the oil of oregano we use in the tablet form, and other products that we have used from biotic research is the dysbiocide and fcicidol. These are the ones that we have used in combination, either 3 or 4 of them, to be able to get the maximum benefit. Especially if there's a fungal component, I like this because some of these herbs, they capture the fungus as well. I may be able to kind of get 2 birds with 1 stone, if you will.
Okay, great. So in a sense, sometimes the herbal treatment, would you say, is a little bit more broad, but not as strong, in a sense, perhaps. Is that a reasonable way of understanding it?
I think that's a good way to put it. I would have less concern to have more permanent changes in the microbiome, if you will. That's
right. Okay. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, and then just shifting gears onto leaky gut and talking, we've talked about the treatment quite a bit. Could you talk about this? And this is actually really exciting to me because a lot of this is new for me. Could you talk a bit about these treatments that you use for leaky gut and which you find to be particularly helpful?
Well, I brought up some of these discussions because I think people should know that these are out there and we kind of use them here and there. For example, lubiprostone is a medication available in US, And it is used in very, very minute amounts. I mean, patients may use as little as 8 micrograms once or twice a day, and it works on the chloride channel. And the drug was originally released in US for IBS symptoms and constipation. It works on the chloride channel, but when you look at the animal data, it actually has some effects on tight junctions. And now they even have it in the brochure that comes with the drug. It is mentioned, the research on this is mentioned. So if I have somebody with constipation and bloating, and I also suspect they have a leaky gut, I don't mind to use lubiprostone as a product. It doesn't absorb. It basically is in minute amount of peptide, and so I'm not so concerned, with the use of this, and I think it would be a good choice to consider for the patients.
And have you had good results with using lubiprostone?
Overall, yes, especially if there's a constipation or IBS type symptoms, it has been an additional component. I cannot say that by itself is enough to fix a leaky gut problem. Plus, the leaky gut may have different mechanisms, but it could be something in the armamentarium to use.
Okay, great. And tell us a little bit about BPC 157. That seems to be a fascinating new treatment.
Right. The BPC 157 it's a peptide which is actually created or generated in the stomach juice. And the credit goes to Dr. Sekiric from Croatia, whom I had the opportunity to visit this last September. I was so fascinated by his research. I made a trip to Zagreb, and I met with him. He took me to his lab, and I looked at the research behind it. He has many, many articles with different benefits that comes from this little molecule. In simple words, it seems to have a healing effect on the surfaces. And even though many physicians or patients have used it for orthopedic problems, we feel that this is generated in the stomach juice and it has an effect on intestinal lining. Why not just use it orally? So we have asked our pharmacy to compound this and prepare this in an oral format in very small amounts. And it seems to be very, very effective from the feedback that our patients have given us.
Okay, great. And so that's another treatment. And would you ever use that together with the lubiprostone?
Yes, I don't see a problem. If necessary, I may use more than one element in the armamentarium. Again, lubiprostone would be, valuable if the bloating does not go away, if I have constipation, and I need some improved effecatory effect by by stimulating the chloride channel and producing more water in the colon. So that may be a good combination.
Okay, great. And could you just touch on natural treatments as well for leaky gut? As you know, Restore is a new product which has been heavily marketed, if you like, for leaky gut, and there's a number of other things. Would you mind speaking about those?
Restore, again, from what I understand, it has special forms of carbon molecules that works as a binder. And this was based probably on the thought process, from what I understand, on glyphosate being a product that is getting in our food chain system and is causing damage to our tight junctions and creating food sensitivity and so forth. So nowadays we have started to actually measure glyphosate in organic acid panels. There's one lab in US, the Great Plains Labs, that provides that. And again, if you find a high level of glyphosate, obviously you need to make sure the patient is not getting foods with Roundup in it, but you can use the Restore to maybe bind some of this product and improve the tight junctions there. Overall, is helpful, and it could be another element in the armamentarium. If you didn't measure it, then you can probably just treat the patient empirically and see if you saw clinical benefits. Glutamine obviously is an amino acid that is most commonly used at the level of the intestines, so we usually incorporate that. One caution: if a patient has ADHD or some of the autism spectrum disorders, one has to be careful because they may, convert this into glutamate and they may become more agitated. So if you suspect that, just go slower on that. Zinc carnosine has some data that it helps to activate the white cells and it maybe helps with clearing infection at the level of the gut. So it is commonly used as part of the armamentarium. We frequently use amino acids, particularly when we feel there is malabsorption and malnutrition. When patients have gone through long periods of time with poor intake, it is very likely that they don't have adequate amount of amino acids. And if we don't have enough amino acids, the gastric juicing, the pancreatic juicing, everything gets affected. And the stem cells, remember, the repair process needs amino acids. So we feel these nutrients should be readily available. And again, vitamins, we try to go orally, maybe more so in powder format for better absorption. So we use capsules. But again, for highly malnourished patients, we use IV infusions, or we recommend that with referral. Omega-3s, from what I understand, and CLA, they seem to help with the process of leaky gut repair. Perhaps by balancing it with omega-6 and creating a better balance in the omega-6 omega-3 ratio, if you will.
Great, thank you very much for that. It's good to see that there is a growing armamentarium for leaky gut, because it does really seem to be a big problem. Should we touch on this, or maybe skip? We're running a little bit behind here. Would you like anything that you'd like to touch on here, particularly that you think is important?
Yeah, I'll get quick on this one. I said the lifestyle is very, very important. People can't do the wrong thing, be under stress, ignore their feelings or sleep pattern. So we generally tell people, do not eat or drink it before you go to bed. It's a no man's land. No water, no tea, no supplements. So and stress management, very, very important. And reduction or elimination of alcohol is crucial. And if patients drink wine, they end up with more acid reflux. If they end up on acid reducer, then we're back into a vicious cycle again.
Great, thank you. And as we know, there's a bunch of other prokinetic agents that can also be used in SIBO, such as Motility and metoclopramide, etc. Maybe we could just very briefly talk about diets as well. Would you like to talk a bit about what diet you feel is really important for people who have significant gut problems as part of a SIRS picture?
Most of the patients, by the time they come to us, they have experimented with a variety of the diets. And I think the diet issue has to be individualized. If there are food allergies or something that turns up the inflammatory process, obviously the major ones need to be taken out and take less of the other ones and try to be on a rotation diet. If SIBO is an issue, then after the treatment, not necessarily before treatment, but after the treatment, the fermentation process should be reduced. So eating foods that would have less capability to get fermented would be important. And there are different protocols in the, we use CIRS low fermentation diet. Dr. Seebecker has a nice way of demonstrating the spectrum of the fermentation, and patients can experiment with that. But the discussion of the diet becomes so individualized that I really think once we have some of the results and response to the treatments as a maintenance, they really need to work with an educated or knowledgeable nutritional consultant to be able to customize what would be most appropriate for that person.
Great. Okay, then. Thanks very much for that. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so we'll skip over that. So just jumping ahead now, if you don't mind me just spending a minute or two just speaking about the Mold Illness Made Simple course. Really, I just wanted to explain why people who are suffering with SIRS or a related illness may find that this course could be of benefit. And I guess really the biggest reason is just to get a clear path forward. The reason that essentially I created this course was that I realized there was a lot of overwhelm and confusion around the subject of SIRS and recovery from SIRS, and that the information that was already available was not necessarily that clear and understandable, and that it's already a hugely anxiety-provoking thing for a patient to find out that their house may be making them sick. And therefore, I considered it was very important to have very clear and simple information that helps to bring clarity and calm into the picture. And I actually believe that's a really important part of getting better from this illness as well, is just getting into a state of clarity and calm and feeling like I've got this. And therefore, I believe this course is a useful option if you want to try and get a clear path forward and not get too much confusion. And that currently a lot of other information sources out there are somewhat confusing. So, look, this course isn't for everyone. It's not really a kind of instant gratification kind of thing. It's for people who are willing to put in at least 1 to 2 hours a week for around 8 weeks and to invest the time in learning about this illness. And it will mean learning about the alphabet soup that exists, which is things like C4A and TGF-beta 1 and MMP9 and MSH. And that can be a little bit tricky if you've got a foggy brain, but basically, as far as we can see, there's no way around it. You've just got to invest that little bit of time to understand the science behind this illness. And once you've got that, you actually should feel a lot more clarity, and you should feel a lot more confidence that you can get better from this illness. So what we have in this course is 8 weeks, and that consists of 18 chapters. Now, each chapter has a video lecture and slides which you can download. There's also a workbook which you can download as a PDF for each chapter. So on the right-hand side of this diagram, you see what the PDF workbook looks like, and on the left-hand side, the example of the slides. And then there are weekly quizzes to make sure you've understood the information properly, and sometimes they can just point to the need for going back and revising some information. There's also a private Facebook group once you reach around week 5 that you can join in the discussion and start asking questions for anything that you're not clear on. And myself and also Caleb Rudd, who's been my collaborator on the course, are regularly on that group and can assist with answering questions. Next slide, thanks. So, and I think, Dr. Rahbar, you've had an opportunity to have a look at the course, is that right? And did you have any feedback that you wanted to share about it?
I love it. I thought it was great. Go to the course and enjoy this thing. I didn't want to stop. I'll just keep going.
Thanks so much for saying that. So as usual with these webinars, we really do want to help people to get access to the course if you are suffering with this illness. And so we are offering a 25% off. And so if you use this code BEAT-SIBO, then it is 25% off to $149.25 US. And there will be a link below in this YouTube page that you can click on. You should be able to see that now. And if you click on that link, you can enter in the coupon code and get instant access. So basically, to summarize, the Mold Illness Made Simple course just gives you a clear path forward to understanding this illness and charting the path to recovery, if that's what you're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. And do you have a few minutes for a few questions, Dr. Rahbar?
I do have.
Okay, great. Well, we've got a few questions that have been submitted by people who are listening to this call, and obviously it's quite a complicated area when we start looking at SIBO and leaky gut and their connection to SIRS. So I'll just take a moment to see if some questions can start filtering through here. Just one moment. I'll just quickly. Now, I might ask, okay, so the first one, how do you accurately diagnose food sensitivities or allergies? Do you find that elimination is more helpful or IgG testing? And if so, by which lab?
The elimination concept is generally done by allergies. We do not do this in the practice. For food IgE, which is more immediate reactions, we obviously use basic labs, and they will, if you see something with IgE, which is more immediate reaction, obviously they would need to eliminate that or significantly reduce it, depending upon what the level of the reaction is. The IgG test is not quite accepted or popular by the more classical, centers, if you will. And sometimes there's a challenge to getting it approved and so forth. But as I said, overall, I find it helpful. I cannot tell you one lab is better than another. I kind of find them, for this particular basic test is they're almost equal. So whichever lab does it, I can look at the data. However, there's another form of IgG called IgG4, which may have a little bit more relevance in the clinical practice because IgG4, for example, traditionally is used to diagnose autoimmune pancreatitis. That's a condition that where the IgG4 level goes up. So if I have access to a lab, for example, Genova in US does IgG4 testing for a variety of foods, and I kind of, if I have, the patient has the resources, I usually use that one instead of a regular IgG testing.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer. And since CSM or cholestyramine is a widely used binder for eliminating mold toxin and also has impacts on the gut, what do you recommend for those wanting to take cholestyramine but also have SIBO and motility issues?
Well, my feeling is that if there's constipation, one has to address that and the SIBO first as much as possible before adding cholestyramine. I also want to make sure that it's taken away from the nutrients so it doesn't interfere with that. So the key would be, how do I get constipation resolved and elimination, corrected before I add the cholestyramine as a binder?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, great. So treating the SIBO first and addressing the constipation and then going on to the CSM. Do you recommend using a Neti pot during or after MARCoNS treatment, or is this unnecessary? Also, does motility, this is a second question, does motility improve on its own after MARCoNS treatment and or progress with mold toxin detox?
Scientifically speaking, I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know of any research saying that the motility has improved. It's not so easy to measure motility. If you're talking about constipation, yes, many patients you treat the gut dysbiosis, constipation gets better. But the word motility also implies to gastric motility, small bowel motility, and I don't have enough data to answer that question.
Okay.
I mean,
yep, that's fine. Okay, great. And the Neti pot, the answer with regard to the Neti pot was a yes, wasn't it? You do recommend the Neti pot?
Yeah, I mean, we do recommend ongoing nasal irrigation for a while, sometimes even once a day or a few times a week to continue to reduce the mucus load.
Okay, great. And then one question is, do you have any data on whether long-term binder use helps or harms the gut flora? For instance, charcoal, microsilica, clay, cholestyramine, Welchol, etc.
I don't have a scientific answer to that, but I can tell you that we don't use it on a long-term basis. Usually 1 to 3 months is the time frame that we use it for, at least intermittently.
Okay, great. And could you explain how you feel heavy metals influence the process of SIBO and leaky gut and SIRS?
I think they add to the problem. It becomes a huge allostatic load, and we do a screen for heavy metals. It doesn't make sense if I'm treating gut dysbiosis and somebody continuing to eat sushi and tuna. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, each time, most of the patients, they have detox issues and their system is overwhelmed already. And if you add the heavy metals, it's just going to interfere with cellular function at the level of the gut, and it's going to become very difficult, particularly to get rid of the fungus.
Okay, a couple more. So can you please explain why BEG nasal spray is no longer the preferred treatment for MARCoNS? My doctor has prescribed BEA spray for me. Should I avoid using this and ask him about colloidal silver and EDTA instead?
I must defer that answer to you.
Okay, yeah, well, I think the answer is actually that that Dr. Shoemaker and other colleagues were concerned about resistance, bacterial resistance in MARCoNS, which seems to be increasing very much. And he did present a paper at Irvine, California, or an abstract suggesting that he's seeing an increased amount of gentamicin and vancomycin resistance. And that had actually been put down somewhat to antifungal use. And so the BEA spray would have amphotericin in it, and the BEG spray has gentamicin in it. So it would seem logical that giving gentamicin might contribute to more gentamicin resistance. So more and more we're moving to the idea that it's more of a biofilm problem, the MARCoNS, and not really, we don't necessarily need very heavy-duty antimicrobials, and therefore something like EDTA, which is an anti-biofilm agent, just added to a fairly weak antimicrobial, which the silver is, seems to be quite effective. And I think it's a good development and will help to prevent more multi-resistant MARCoNS, if you like.
I make one comment, if I may say. Occasionally, if the patients swallow the gentamicin or other antibiotics and they have gut issues, particularly fungus, it may bring on some fungal-related symptoms. We have had that instance. So,
yeah, that's another really important point. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay, I'm going to suggest, there are a couple more questions, but I'm going to suggest we wind up at this point because we're probably both going to move on, and I've got a patient in around 10 minutes. So I just wanted to give a big thank you to Dr. Farshid Rahbar for joining us today and sharing his knowledge on integrative gastroenterology and SIBO and leaky gut. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time you've given us. And hope to be in touch further in future on future webinars and so on.
Thank you for this invitation. All the best.
And also a big thank you to Caleb Rudd for the content and technical support. So have a great rest of the day, everyone, and I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, got something out of it, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.